All right, all you Game of Thrones makers out there, I've got one for you. We're going to make this polymer clay dragon's egg. It's got that new dragon smell. So let's get into the project. What I'm going to need is a few things. The first thing I needed to figure out was the base. And, you know, it could have been a lot of things. It could have just been a lot of like wadded up paper and tinfoil. It just needs to not burst into flames when I bake it. But a quick trip to the hobby store netted me this. It's actually Easter right now, and so the shelves were just chock-a-block full of this kind of stuff. It's a good size. It's got a little bit of heft to it, which means that the final piece is going to have some weight to it. The only thing that's a little weird about it is it's a decoration. It's supposed to stand on its own, so it has this hole in the bottom and a flat spot. That's easily fixed with a little bit of tinfoil sort of packed in and rounded, and then I'm going to cover it with clay. So kind of a win here. This was really affordable, and it's a good starting point. For the clay, I'm going to use some Super Sculpey. This is polymer clay. It comes in beige, white, and like beige and white. And so since this is going to be painted, it doesn't really matter what color it is. This is a 1 pound block. It's probably going to take a little bit more than a pound, so I've got some backup. I need to roll out a lot of slabs, and so I could use something like this. This is just an acrylic roller. You can pick these up for working on polymer clay. I could take some popsicle sticks, some tongue depressors. I could stack them up to the thickness that I need them to stack up to be, and then I could just roll some slabs. It's a great way. I use this a lot, this technique, when I'm working with metal clay. I have some, thickness gauges that I can just roll out really, really precise thicknesses in the metal clay. But I'm going to be needing a lot of slabs, a lot of scales for the project. So what I'm going to use is this. This is just a really inexpensive pasta machine. You can pick these up pretty darn cheap, and if you plan on doing any work with polymer clay or other clays where you're going to roll a lot, like metal clays or polymer clays, it's probably well worth picking one of these up. They serve a bunch of purposes. The one obvious prime purpose is, you can roll lots of thin sheets. The other thing that's really nice about this is that after a while, polymer clays that sit around, they kind of get hard to work with. They sort of stiffen up a little bit, and it takes a lot of work to get them back to sort of a smooth and pliable consistency. Doing that by hand can really give your hands a workout. And so using a pasta machine like this, I can just actually crank the clay through, fold it, crank it through a couple times, and I can get it really quickly back to a usable consistency. So that's something that is sort of a bonus to having something like this. Not necessary. We can actually just roll it out with a roller, but this is going to make things go a lot faster. I'll need some stuff to cut with. So, utility knife. This is actually just a thin blade that's used for cutting canes. I have a needle tool somewhere floating around if I wanted to cut some thin shapes with a needle tool. That could literally be a T-pin on a stick. We can really get away with not using a lot of stuff for this. And that's really one of the nice things about polymer clay. You can actually do some pretty cool stuff without a huge investment in materials and tools. Things to cut straight edges. Nothing's going to really be right angles and straight edges on this, but it's always good to sort of have those things kicking around. Now, these tools, I don't know if I'm ever really going to use these on this project. These are nice for maybe smoothing out areas where I might need to get in and smooth some things out in the clay, if I wanted to poke some dimples in. But I'll have them handy, but I think I can get away without using anything like this. All of those things can be substituted for paintbrush ends. Popsicle sticks, again, could be little smoothing tools. You can improvise a lot of this stuff without having to buy it. Another big thing that I'm going to need is a way to texture parts of this. In the reference photos for these Game of Thrones eggs, you'll see that the top portion is scales. At the bottom, it actually looks like sort of fossilized or rock. These are supposed to have been, originally the story was that these were found, you know, in the wastelands, and they were, you know, fossilized and basically not real things. And then, you know, they hatch and ta-da, and, you know, mother of dragons and you know, all of that good stuff. But they have sort of this rocky base. So I need something to sort of texture that. So, you know, I went out to the yard, kicked around the neighborhood, and scrounged up some rocks, you know, crawling around in ditches, you know, going through the neighbor's xeriscape. But what I ended up with was just some lava rock. So this has some nice texture. I can maybe push into it. Just some regular rock so that, again, I can sort of get a nice rough, uneven surface, use different edges. So this is a great way to get really, really natural textures. Go out and get some natural things, and then you can just push that right into the polymer clay. If you happen to live in some sort of rock-free environment, you can actually just take things like tinfoil, scrunch it up, push it in, and use that, and you get really, really similar effects. You can also use this for other textures that you may not be able to get with just a thing like a rock. So always be looking out for things that you can squish into the clay and make some cool textures. Really, in the grand scheme of things, oh, we need one other thing. Sorry. I need to make some cookie cutters, some scale cookie cutters, because I need to cut a lot of scales. I'm thinking this is probably in the low hundreds to cover this. So to do that, I'm going to roll slabs with the pasta machine, and then I'm going to take these little cookie cutters that I've made that are scale shaped, and I'm just going to punch them out. I'll show you how I made these, and really to do that, what I'm going to need is a little bit of aluminum material. Now this is just aluminum flashing. You can get rolls of this stuff at the hardware store. I've got basically one roll for me is going to be probably a lifetime supply, but it's actually really nice material to work with. But you can also just use pieces that you cut out of disposable cooking trays, those heavy duty cooking pans that you can get at the grocery store. Those are pretty cheap, and there's some smooth, usable sections that you can work with. You could probably even cut this out of some sort of an aluminum can. That might be a little on the flimsy side, but the reality is this needs to last just long enough for the project. So I'll show you how to make these in a minute. All right, so basically egg, clay, some way to roll it out, and some way to punch out some shapes, and some ways to maybe give it a little bit of texture. With this, I could probably pull this thing off. And then some acrylic paint down the road. We'll talk about that when we get to painting. All right, so let's really dive into the first thing. What I'm going to do is I'm going to fix this bottom. So to do that, I'm going to take some tinfoil, not this tinfoil, but a piece of tinfoil, and I'm just going to sort of make a little, almost like a little mushroom shape, jam some of it in there to hold it in place, and then just really pack it around. And then I can also take it and really kind of roll it into a nice shape and really get that nice and dense. At that point, I'll cover this whole base with a thin slab of the Super Sculpey, of the polymer clay. What I'll do at that point then is go in and sort of create an uneven line on the bottom. I don't want a lot of thickness where I'm going to start to run scales up, so I'm going to kind of dive down and give it sort of a nice uneven shape. Maybe it sort of drives up a little bit high, maybe a third of the way, and then maybe it comes down maybe to a little bit more like a quarter. And that's where that's sort of my transition point from the base to the scales. Once that cut is covered, I'll maybe give it a layer, another layer in areas where I want to sort of build it up and really do some heavy texturing. So I'll do some patches that are where I'm going to give it some really dense texture. Once it's covered, I'm going to just go in and just work in the textures with the rock till I get it to sort of that stone fossilized texture that is good for the base. At that point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to bake it. I'm going to bake the base. And in doing that, it'll allow me then to hold the egg on the base when I start to work the scales up. One of the challenges with anything like clay, polymer clay, is, you know, it will take fingerprints, it'll deform if you're handling it a lot. And polymer clay in particular, as it's sort of, if you're touching it and you're holding it, it warms up, and as it warms up, it becomes even softer. So it becomes sort of this progressive challenge to work with. One quick technique to make it a little bit more durable for handling, if you're working on a small piece and you can do this, is to actually refrigerate it periodically. You know, chill it down, it'll sort of stiffen it up a little bit, and then you can go back in and you can work on other areas and work some pieces in. It'll then start to, again, soften. You chill it down again and sort of rinse and repeat again. This one, though, I don't want to go through that. I'm just going to bake it. Polymer clays can be baked multiple times. And so what I'll do is, once that's baked, I'll work on the scales and then bake it again. So I think that's what we need to get going. Let's go ahead and jump in and start on working on this bottom portion of our Game of Thrones dragon's egg. The base is covered with clay and it's been baked. I'm really actually pretty happy with how this is turning out. The rocks actually gave it a really nice texture, and the lava rocks, or the pumice, really gave it some very, very cool little dotted texture through here. I was sort of sparing in my application of that, but I think when this is painted and those are highlighted, those are going to really show some very nice texture and a little bit of detail. On the base too, I also did some sort of kind of a, you know, swirling pattern around the base so that it, and you know, nothing is even, which is good. It's a little weird and misshapen and lumpy, and that's exactly the way I want it. But that sort of end is, you know, kind of felt like, you know, maybe as it was sort of just, you know, out of the dragon, you know, there was some sort of weird attachment point there that went, you know, and I don't know. You know, my mind works in weird ways, but it gives it a nice kind of cool sort of base to it without being a real base. Okay, so the next step is to roll out and cut a lot of scales to really finish this up. So if we look at our reference screen grabs, what we've got is about, depending on where you count from, about 8 to 11-ish rows of scales. It's kind of hard to really dial it in, but you know, somewhere in that 8 to 10 or 11 rows seems to be about the right size. So if we look at this little cutter, scale cutter, if we go maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, that's probably, I'm probably underestimating a little bit because there's more overlap. This feels like it's getting me in the right space as far as size goes. This one's a little bit smaller. So I think as I move up, I'll start to intersperse and then transition over to the smaller scales. They're actually throughout the whole length of the egg pretty large. They don't get too terribly progressively smaller. So between these two, I should be good to go. Now, how did I make these? Well, it's pretty simple. What I did was I took some of my aluminum flashing, and what you want to do is be very, very careful. Once you start to cut this material, these edges become exceedingly sharp. Not so much this way, but you do not want to really run your hand along that edge. But what I would do is just take that edge, start to roll it over, and what I'm trying to do is really just initially get it into sort of a circular shape that is of the general volume that I need. So if I'm going and I need a little bit of overlap because I need to stick it together. So I'm going to kind of roll it up. And if I was making a scale around my larger size here, I want it to be somewhere in, you know, this sort of size. I'm really just shooting for kind of the overall volume. Okay. Now, what I want to do is I want to stick these together. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to trim off some of my excess here. I'm going to mark it really quickly if I can find something to mark it with. Right about, I'm going to have maybe a 1/2 inch of overlap. Mark it there. And I just want, while I've got some excess material, I just really want to kind of have some leverage to bend that over so that it's going to be nice and curved. It's really hard when you've got just a little bit at the edge to try and get that tucked over. So I've got that. This is my cut mark. Don't use your good scissors when cutting aluminum. And I'm going to want this to overlap just about like that. Now, I've tried double stick tape and some other things and, you know, varying success. What I'm going to use though is just a little bit of super glue. The trick here is just to try not to glue your hand to this thing, which I've almost mostly done. This is gel, so it's a little thicker. I'm going to bring it up and get it where I want it. I'm going to try and hold it. See, I'm already sticking my fingers down. Hold it in place. Try and start to get that sticking down. And then I'm going to hit it with a little bit of the quick set to get it to stick down. I didn't do too bad a job sticking my fingers down. Now there are probably some other easier ways to do this. Maybe like a super sticky double stick. But this is pretty quick and easy. And as long as you're relatively careful, you won't glue your fingers together, and that's okay. So now I've got that in place. And at this point, I'm going to shape it into the scale. Now these scales are kind of pointed. I'm going to be careful also not to slice my fingers. So these are kind of pointed, and they're kind of almost like a guitar pick shape. So I'm going to pinch them into sort of a triangle to begin with, and then I'm just going to bow it up a little bit. Got a little bit of a piece sticking up there, but that should be okay because we're going to smooth these a little bit as we go. So this is kind of my shape. It's about the same size. I'm going to maybe bow that in a little bit and just work it to the shape that you want it to be. Again, these don't need to be hyper accurate or hyper regular. Again, these are supposed to be sort of a natural thing. Not going to worry about this back end too much, but what I am going to do is I'm just going to take a little bit of tape and I'm going to run it around the edge for two reasons. Kind of help keep it from spraying apart in case that super glue does decide it wants to give. But it also keeps me from having a sharp edge around this back piece as I'm cutting out. So really crude, you know, this is not an overly elegant piece, but overall this is going to work really well to just be chopping out things out of the polymer clay for these scales. Now if the edge is a little uneven, I can just kind of go in and I can just trim it up so that it's flat and it should work pretty well. Okay, so there's another one of the cutters. So the next step will be to be taking some of our Sculpey. And so this is about how much we've used, or I've used so far. Really not that much. We're really not even into the total block. I'm going to take some of the Sculpey and we're going to just start working it and cutting out scales. Now I'm going over to my pasta machine. I'm rolling it through a couple times. You can see how nicely that works. Here's my new one. It's got this little tab, but that's okay because the way we're going to do these, we're going to just overlap them. And so a lot of that's going to get covered. So that little, it'd be nice to avoid that, but some of these work better than others. That one works pretty well. The little one works nice as well. So the general process is going to be to cut out an insane amount of these. So I'm just going to roll them out. I'm just going to be cutting and cutting and cutting. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to work around the edges. I'm going to make these even rows. Going to have to come down enough to cover into that. So I'll work around. I won't make you watch all of this. We'll kick over here to super speed making. So I'll work it around. Once I get one row, I will come back and overlap. Continue to work the rows around. Another row, and then bring those in and overlap that. So basically just working my way all the way around, building those rows up, and then eventually I will get to the top and I will have, at that point, pretty much, short of painting, the complete egg. Now I can work these down a little bit so that they're not completely even and monotonous. You know, some I can make more pointed, some I can blunt a little bit. So it's nice to sort of have it irregular too. I don't want to be, again, overly regular, overly consistent with this. So on to a lot of rolling, a lot of cutting, and a lot of sticking of scales. So we'll be back in a mo. The base of the egg is done, and you know, I'm really pleased with the way this is turning out. It's really hard to sort of express kind of the tactile sensation of holding this pretty massive thing with the scales, the texture. It's really just kind of a nice piece. I baked this actually 3 times, and I think that I went one bake too far. I baked the base so that I would have a solid surface to hold and work on handle as I moved up through the scales. And then I baked the scales. Everything was great and spiffy, but then I did a little bit of patching and tweaking, and I baked it one last time. And what I noticed is coming out of the oven, I ended up with some stress cracks. And I think what happened was, as this was baked that third time, everything was pretty rigid. And so it either continued to shrink a little bit, or maybe the core expanded a tiny bit, and it caused some cracking because there just wasn't any give left in the material. My guess is, as these are being heated the first time, part of that polymerization and sort of that baking out of the plasticizers, you know, it's got some stretch to it. So it's able to kind of give and take a little bit, and you don't end up with cracks. Well, you continue to sort of stress the material after the first go around, and all of that give and take is out of it, and then you end up with cracking. So it's just something to think about when you're working with this material. You want to make sure that you're not going to overly stress any of the things you're making. In particular, this is on a very rigid core. If this was on some sort of a core that had a little bit of give to it that could be compressed, that might not have been an issue. Now, that's not a big deal. I'm going to go in, I'll just patch them where they're bothering me, and maybe even leave a few where it looks like, you know, maybe a scale was cracked over time. There's going to be a fair amount of painting on this, so a lot of those are going to get filled, softened anyway. The next step is to go into painting. What I'm going to do is fill those cracks where they're bothering me. I'm going to give it a base primer coat, and then just start to go in with acrylic paint. So the basic process will really just be washes of color. I might bust out the airbrush a little bit on this. There's sort of a nice gradation or gradient on the finish. And then I think one of the last things I'm going to do is I'm going to hit it, maybe just the edges of the scales with an interference paint, so that will provide just a slight amount of iridescence. Now, that's not something I'm seeing specifically in the frame grabs of the prop itself. This is, to some extent, you know, this is very much based on the Game of Thrones eggs, but at the same time, you know, we can all make things sort of the way we want them as well. This isn't supposed to be an exact replica. So, on to filling, priming, and painting. So I think the painting is done. It was really pretty straightforward, just painting it really dark with a combination of hooker's green, burnt umber, a little bit of black, and maybe a little bit of yellow ochre or cad yellow. Once that dried, it was just then taking varying shades of and darknesses of the hooker's green, burnt umber, that same mixture, and then just dry brushing it down across the scales. On the base, this is really just mostly yellow ochre, a little bit of hooker's green, some burnt umber, really thin, really washy, and then a little bit of sort of dry brushing across it with a touch of the cad yellow mixed in and a little bit of white. The last thing that I think I want to do is take and just really lightly hit some of the scales with an interference green. So it's going to give it almost like an iridescent, really, really subtle iridescent look when the light hits it in a particular way. I don't have any of that right now. It's on order and it'll be in a couple days. But once that comes in, I think that will be the finishing touch. I'll give it a coat of a protective clear coat just to make sure it's going to handle a little bit of wear and tear, just a touch, and call it done. So that was it. Not too bad. 4.5 hours all in. I hope that you're inspired to maybe go and make one of your own. As always, if you like this video, click that subscribe button below, and we'll see you back on another project really soon.